Hi everybody, today's story is called Christmas in Exeter Street. The day before Christmas Eve, Ben and Jane's grandma and grandpa came to stay at the house in Exeter Street. It was a lovely old house with big friendly windows, a holly wreath on the front door and 3 chimney pots shaped like the crowns of the 3 wise men. Grandpa George was a tall old sailor who came in his sea boots. Grandma Ginny came with her knitting and her 3 cats, 1, 2 and 3. Wherever Grandma Ginny went, her knitting needles went in and out under her elbows, and 1, 2 and 3 followed along behind her. Grandpa George and Grandma Ginny brought a Christmas tree. Ben and Jane's mother, Mrs. Maggie Mistletoe, showed Grandpa George and Grandma Ginny where they were to sleep. She had given them the best spare bedroom. This had a big 4-poster bed in it. Grandpa George parked his sea boots underneath it, and the 3 cats jumped onto the bed and curled up together. Ben and Jane's other grandma and grandpa also came to the house in Exeter Street. They were small and skinny and wore their best hats, a woolly bobble hat for Grandpa Angus and a beret with stars on it for Grandma Franny. Grandma Franny bought a jar of her special cranberry jelly. Grandpa Angus and Grandma Franny were given the second best spare bedroom. This had a small iron bedstead in it. Grandma Franny said, "This bed is just the right size for 2 skinnies like us. We can snuggle up together." Grandpa Angus hung his bobble hat on one knob of the bed, and Grandma Franny hung her star-spangled beret on the other knob of the bed. Ben and Jane's friends, Amelia, Annie and Amos, arrived on Christmas Eve. Their parents had gone to Timbuktu on very important business, and so they came to spend Christmas at the house in Exeter Street. Amelia brought a basket of presents, Annie brought a big Christmas pudding, and Amos, who was only 3, brought his cuddly blanket, and it trailed along behind him like a long, long tail. Mrs. Mistletoe took Amelia, Annie and Amos up the stairs to the attic. There they found 5 beds, 2 bunk beds, one for Ben and one for Amos, 2 mattresses on the floor for Jane and Annie, and 1 camp bed with wobbly legs for Amelia. "Mind you all hang up your Christmas stockings," said Mrs. Mistletoe. Amos climbed up and down the ladder to the top bunk, trailing his blankie behind him. Just after supper, an unexpected uncle arrived. It was Uncle Bartholomew, back from Australia. Mrs. Mistletoe made up a bed for him on the sofa in front of the fire. This was just right for Uncle Bartholomew. Because it had been very hot in Australia, he was feeling very chilly. He was so cold he couldn't take off his mittens. Uncle Bartholomew bought a great box of Australian Delight, which was like Turkish Delight, only nicer. The next to arrive was Mrs. Mistletoe's friend Lily, who had nowhere to live, and with Lily came Lily's baby, Lily Lou. Lily slept on the small sofa in the playroom, which had been bounced on so often it was a very funny sagging shape. Lily bought homemade Christmas hats, each with a star glued on the front. The kitchen sink was dried out very carefully, then lined with blankets, and Lily Lou slept in there. Mrs. Mistletoe hung Lily Lou's stocking over the tap. Lily Lou brought her smile. Christmas Eve was very stormy and the vicar's roof blew off, so he and his wife and their 4 children all came to the house in Exeter Street. "Is there any room in the inn?" asked the vicar, and Mrs. Mistletoe said yes, there was. "We've brought you a carol," said the vicar, and they all stood on the doorstep and sang Away in a Manger. A bed was made up for the vicar and his wife in the bath, and a lot of cushions were piled up in the corridor for the 4 children. By this time, there was quite a lot of noise in the house in Exeter Street, and the children next door, Thomas, Tessa and Timothy, came to join the party. They came in their pyjamas and they brought their sleeping bags and their Christmas stockings, and they made a camp in the study. At 9 o'clock, 5 uncles came from Abingdon, bringing with them a big turkey and their 3 Pekingese dogs. The aunts, Catherine, Clara, Christabel, Clothida and Christiana were very thin ladies, so each of them was given a shelf on the dresser in the kitchen and tucked up tightly between the plates and the dangling cups. The Pekingese dogs were packed into shopping baskets and tucked in with dolls' blankets kindly provided by Jane. At midnight, 2 men knocked on the door and asked for a bed for the night because their car had broken down. Each was given a mantelpiece. The first man said, "Please can our wives come in and we will all squash up together on the mantelpiece?" But Mrs. Mistletoe said she didn't really think 2 people could fit on one mantelpiece. "I have 2 large window sills to spare," she said. "Would you like to curl up there?" And the wives said yes, please. And was there a corner for their 5 children who were still in the car? Mrs. Mistletoe gave a small sigh and said that if Jane and Annie came into her bed, then the 5 children could sleep on the 2 mattresses in the attic. The car children brought an enormous box of crackers. When everyone was safely tucked up in bed, Mrs. Mistletoe counted the number of children asleep in the house in Exeter Street, and then she wrote a note for Father Christmas and pinned it on the front door. "Dear Father Christmas, there are 18 children here. Please don't forget anyone. Love, Maggie Mistletoe. P.S. Lily Lou is in the kitchen sink." No sooner had Mrs. Mistletoe got into bed with Jane and Annie than she heard a sound of crying at the front door. She crept down the stairs and looked outside. There on the mat was a small black cat. He brought his snow-white paws. The small black cat slipped inside and found the room where Uncle Bartholomew was asleep on the sofa, dreaming about kangaroos. The small black cat sniffed Uncle Bartholomew and curled up at his feet. The last person to arrive at the house in Exeter Street had a lot of trouble with his arithmetic. Father Christmas had to take off his boots and count on his toes to make sure he had remembered all 18 children. And he had, even Lily Lou. On Christmas Day morning, they took Lily Lou out of the sink, and Mrs. Mistletoe and Jane and Grandpa George peeled a whole sack of potatoes, and then they all had a splendid Christmas dinner. They ate the Abingdon Aunt's turkey with Grandma Franny's cranberry jelly, and afterwards they had Annie's Christmas pudding. They all wore Lily's Christmas hats, except for Amos, who wore his blankie tied round his head, because he felt happiest that way. And they pulled the car children's crackers. When dinner was over, they sat round the fire and ate Uncle Bartholomew's Australian delight, and it was like eating sunshine. Everyone agreed that the house in Exeter Street was the best place of all to be at Christmas time. The little black cat, curled up in Mrs. Mistletoe's lap, thought he might stay until next Christmas. And Lily Lou, snuggled up in Uncle Bartholomew's arms, waved her little curly fingers at the Christmas tree and smiled and smiled and smiled.